Welcome, everyone. I'm Brandon Harrison, Associate Features Programmer here at Doc NYC. I'm very, very excited and pleased to welcome Deirdre Fisher from Women in Blue. How are you doing today, Deirdre?
I'm good. Great to be here.
Obviously, this film is incredibly poignant and powerful at the current moment. I'm curious if we can go back to this initial, I guess, desires to want to make this film. What was the thought process there, and what was it like getting access to the department?
Well, the impetus was I was in Staten Island filming my last film when Eric Garner was killed, by a chokehold. And I had a friend who was a cop, and I had actually never talked to her about being a cop. But I was so outraged by this incident that I said, could this have happened on your watch? And it wasn't so much that she said no, that it was something she said, well, I would have just started by saying, hey, my name is Sally, what's yours? I got this call. And it was just such a kind of human interaction. And then that got me thinking, do women police differently? And when I found statistics going back to the 1990s and a commission that came after the Rodney King beating in LA that showed that women officers de-escalate better, probably because of the gender norms and the way we're brought up, and use less force, I thought, why isn't anybody exploring this because of how pervasive police violence is? Could women do anything differently to, change what's clearly a very toxic culture? And then I was looking for a police department where it made sense to go and explore what women could bring. And at the time, Minneapolis was one of the few major urban police departments to have a woman chief. It's still quite rare. It's become a little less rare actually since I started. But and when I finally got to her, she said, yeah, just come. You have total access. Because she was actually just starting a recruitment campaign. She knew it was an independent film, but she wanted this issue of women and policing to be elevated. And she said, if someone agrees, you can follow them anywhere on their job.
With that edict, from Chief Harteau, you have these characters. How did you go about choosing them? Were they your first choices? What was that process like?
Well, she did something kind of incredible. She gathered all the women in the department together in a room, and they had in fact never been together. So, women tend to be very marginalized. There's not that many of them. So they kind of know each other, but they're often working almost only with men. And so basically I got in the room. The one person I knew the second I started talking to her was Sergeant Alice White. She was a mother, I was a mother. We were talking about how our like 11-year-old daughters like to sleep in bed with us. I mean, it was just very human. And I thought, wow, there was just something so down to earth and real about her. So I just knew immediately. With the other people, it was kind of a process of talking to them about how open they were to really understanding I was going to be there for years and that I wanted to be able to go home with them. I wanted to be able to show them at work and then sort of how they brought the job home. And then it sort of evolved pretty quickly. Within a few weeks, I had all the characters. Maybe the easiest group of characters to find because of how they were put into a room. And I could sort of talk to them about my vision for the film.
I mean, as you said, it's a years-long process. What is it like building, I guess, this rapport with them over these years, and the narrative, and even the police work, following them on these ride-arounds and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that was so kind of when I came, there had been a officer-involved shooting a year and a half before, and I think people were sort of feeling like they were kind of getting on the other side of that, maybe winning back some community trust. But while I was there, it just was, there were 3 more, and that's before George Floyd. So it was the most tumultuous time in that police department. And I was actually amazed that people kind of hung tight with the process because so much was shifting and changing. And I think it's just because I think that they really did feel like they wanted their lives represented after George Floyd was murdered, and I decided to update the film because it had what's playing at Doc NYC is the updated film. I think everyone got very wary. It got very different. And I suddenly was like reconvincing people to be in the department. And I think that had to do with people had very, very strong feelings about, obviously, about that incident and the reckoning. And they were upset, and they wanted to know why was I going back in? What was my goals and intention? So it was almost, that part was actually harder than the initial, because it is so tense in Minneapolis, and because, you know, this incident has changed America, it's changed the world.
Of course, I had to ask you about that because I had seen the original cut,
Yeah.
and then I was like, "Oh, the update. What has changed?" And the fact that you're able to, you know, get in touch with them, I was really curious about that initial reticence, maybe from them. But even as a filmmaker, you have this film that said a lot of profound things, and now everything about the film that had meaning has an additional meaning. It has layers now. What was it like not only getting in contact with them and getting them to participate, especially when I think about Katherine Johnson being at that precinct, you have to craft this story now. What is that process like for you as a filmmaker?
Well, you know, I mean, to me, I mean, it was really I mean, aside from, you know, the horror that just brutal murder could happen in this department, and in a precinct that I was in a lot, you know, the 3rd precinct, and the opening images of these white men, you know, this sort of history of white men in policing, those burned, you know, so it was just maybe fitting that they burned. Hopefully that things will change. But I really felt like the film didn't really have meaning in some way, because I felt like that it stopped before the biggest thing happened. And that if we didn't have the characters reckoning, whether it's Nikema Levy Armstrong, who's an activist in Minneapolis, or, you know, or Alice, you know, who had already been so devastated about other officer-involved shootings that had happened while we were filming, that the film would seem sort of aborted and sort of not really part of the current conversation. So I felt really motivated to go in. I felt it was really, really important. And I think in the end, that feeling that I had that this was the culmination and that people were having major reckonings, I was able to sort of convince people that I wanted to tell the story, the real story, and take it all the way to the end. I mean, the whole time I was there, I kept thinking, oh my God, like, because this was not the first international incident, police shooting, because one of the people, you know, was Australian, and it became an international incident. And I was just like, I mean, I had no idea when I went to Minneapolis that this department would be the focal point of so much attention. And at the same time, a department that tragically was actually trying to reform itself. So for me now, the new film, really, while I hope that it elevates women and thinking about public safety and what women, particularly Black women, can bring to making it about protecting people and not terrorizing people, I do think the film now shows that incremental change does not work. I mean, it's not about putting in some women. We got to have systemic change. And then I think, let's think about women.
To that point, you have a lot with Nikema Armstrong and the protesters. How were you able to incorporate that? What was the balance that you were trying to show with that side of the film?
Well, I felt like, you know, I mean, there is so much. It's like an incident after incident and outcry after outcry. And when, you know, I think definitely when people who maybe haven't been in Minneapolis and you see the George Floyd and you see what happened, and it's just, it seems so unbelievably horrible, and you completely understand why people are outraged and hit the streets. But when you've been there over and over, someone like Nekima, and you've been crying out and saying like this department is out of control, and she wasn't surprised at all. She wasn't like, oh my God, I can't believe that this happened with George Floyd. She was just like, now it's on, that it was filmed, that, that people could see it, that it happened in quarantine, but she wasn't surprised by the incident because so much had been happening. So certainly I wanted her feeling about that moment. And I think, there was also a lot of anger, like, this could have been avoided. It's so complicated with policing because I think one of the things that people don't look at as much just because is just really the way the police unions are really, really problematic. They are actually, like NYPD just came out in favor of Trump. The head of the police union in Minneapolis was a speaker at the Trump rally. They are a very particular breed. And I know a lot of people just think the police are horrible and it's one monolithic thing. And there's so many horrible things. The system is clearly not working. But there are some individuals who are actually trying, but they're not the people who are aligned with the police union. And I feel like that is really something that I think as a society, if we're going to keep policing in the short term, if we're not going to abolish them, we really have to look at a system where a police chief can try to fire someone and they're back on the job 2 weeks later.
You explain that really well, and I think that's really exhibited through the character of Chief Harteau. Especially you get there, she welcomes you there, gives you all this access, and then her story goes on this sort of journey. And the fact that you were able to bring her back for this new version of the film, I was completely I'm curious about your vision for this story, and you end up here with this character. What was that relationship like between the two of you over the course of a long filmmaking process?
Yeah, that's such a good point because it really is a long process, and we had all of us. There were ups and downs. There was actually one point when the department kind of wouldn't let me talk to one of the women, and but I think with Chief Harteau, when I got there, I think she was very, very excited about a film and very much understood what an independent film was and that she wasn't going to have any control, but just the idea that here was a woman who wanted to share the story of women officers. I think when she was forced to resign, it was problematic and it was hard for her, very, very hard. And then I think, she kind of healed, and then I think she was upset about certain things that were happening in the department. But I think ultimately, George Floyd's murder, like Nekima says, and I understand it, she says it shouldn't have taken George Floyd to wake people up. But the truth is, it took George Floyd to wake some people up. And it woke me up in the sense that I'm like, no, it cannot be incremental forward. We cannot talk about, we got to have the systemic change. And then let's talk about having, more people of color, more women of color, which is really where, and it may just because I just think Alice is such an extraordinary cop. But I think Chief Harteau really, really, it was that wake-up call to say the system as it is, it was naive to think that just because we wanted to change it, we could. And that's a pretty big change.
Ultimately, it's a powerful film. What would you want, I guess, the greater populace to take away from it, considering everything that's happened?
Yeah. It's so hard because I'm not a police expert, I'm a storyteller, but I guess, I guess I would hope that people could see some of the complexities of it and that it is a system. It isn't just the police, and the police certainly have done horrible things, but it's also who's calling the police. It's also the police union. It's also, the laws that are set up. And I hope that people, I think that we should be figuring out a way to support people who are in there and trying to do things differently. What could they do if the system around them wasn't fighting them, but actually helping them reimagine public safety? And I hope that people think about, women. Like it's first of all, every industry, every organization, I think, should have diversity, and they should reflect people that they serve. So, if you've got, you know, an institution that's 88% men with a history of toxic, aggressive masculinity, it makes sense to explore what it could mean to create real, gender equity. But also, when you've got 6 Black women in Minneapolis out of 850 officers, when there is so much distrust in the community, and so many people are living in the suburbs instead of from the community, you know what I mean? So I hope that we can elevate, because I think a lot of people hate the police so much that it's just, like Alice gets a lot of flack, people attack her. And I think maybe there's a way to figure out who's in there and how can we support them and bring other people of moral conscience in to whatever kind of public safety a city decides is the healthiest for their communities.
Thank you, Deirdre, so much for joining us here at Doc NYC. Women in Blue, amazing film. Thanks so much.
Thank you. That was great.